To our annual Constitution Day lecture, our Alexander Hamilton Lecture in Constitutional Studies. I want to thank a few people before I introduce our speaker. First, the sponsors of tonight's event. Thanks to the Government Department, the History Department, the Dean of the Faculty's Office, and the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization have all generously contributed to the funds necessary to make this event possible. Also, a few special thanks. First, someone who's not here, Barbara McDonough, the superwoman of the Government Department who makes everything happen. Thanks to Barbara. Thanks to Maddie Morency for making the poster, the lovely poster. So I appreciate everyone's hard work. Goes into making tonight work. It's a great honor for me to introduce our speaker tonight. Of course, manners dictate that I say this, or at least something like it, but in this case it happens to be quite true. The bad news for me is that it is a daunting task to properly introduce Roger Scruton. Where does one begin? His career is so varied, his writing so wide-ranging, that it's very difficult to wrap it up in a neat little package. He is a philosopher who's written on Kant, Spinoza, and focused much of his attention on the domain of aesthetics, particularly music and architecture. He's written widely in the area of political philosophy, with books on topics ranging from modern conservatism to thinkers of the New Left, to books on law and the Western tradition. He's also written a number of books on religion, including a recent examination of the sacred and how it manifests itself in everyday life. Do you happen to have an interest in wine? Scruton has written on wine. Hunting? Check. The environment? Go get his book, Green Philosophy. You appreciate the difficulty I'm in now, right? Oops, I forgot to mention he's a novelist too. Here, let me recommend his 2014 book, Notes from Underground, which chronicles the life of a young writer in communist-ruled Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. It's a lovely, lovely, and deeply moving book. In all of his works, Scruton writes with the depth, rigor, and authority of a specialist and the common sense, fluidity, and the urgency of a generalist. Two books come immediately to mind on this score, both published in 2010, one simply called Beauty, and the other called The Uses of Pessimism. I think this is the key to his wide-ranging success and why he is so important to so many readers and thinkers with such varied interests. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Roger Scruton to Skidmore College.
Thank you very much, Professor Taylor, for introducing me in such a friendly way. I hope I'll be able to justify a little bit of what you said. Obviously, I'm tackling today an extremely difficult topic, one that is not easy to talk about because it affects the whole nature of the world in which we're living, and in particular, it affects the continent of Europe, which is still my continent, even though I'm constantly tempted to flee to safer places. But nevertheless, I think I want to talk about an aspect of the migration crisis and the way in which the European Union has developed, which I think you all need to understand too, you in America, in order to grasp exactly why it is that the American Constitution and what it's given to you is such a beneficial thing, and why you must hang on to it at all costs, despite all the temptations to the contrary. I want to begin from describing two kinds of jurisdiction. That is to say, the religious on the one hand and the territorial on the other. Okay, people define themselves by their religion, their faith, what they believe, and the membership that grows around that. But they also define themselves in terms of the place where they are, the place that they share with their neighbors, and which has bound them together in a form of life which is located in a particular part of the world. You Americans have a territorial jurisdiction, But not everybody in the world has a territorial jurisdiction. And this is a very important thing to remember. A jurisdiction defines the class of people who are subject to the law. You know, all Americans who are resident here are subject to the law of the United States. The law of the United States is defined over that territory. It doesn't matter what you believe, however religion, who you're related to, what your class is, what your job is, or anything like that. It's your being here, resident in this territory, that makes you subject to the law. And that law also defines the distinction between a citizen, someone who has the right to remain here forever, and the non-citizen, and so on. So territory is absolutely fundamental to the law of the United States and to the law of the European states too. Religion defines a certain kind of membership. At least that's the usual understanding. You belong to the faith. Right? So you can define your identity not in terms of the territory where you are, but perhaps in terms of the beliefs that you share with your fellow religionists. You can define yourself as a Muslim or a Christian or whatever, and there are many fine distinctions. But there's a big question as to which comes first for us modern people. Should the territorial definition come first or the religious? And this is something which is impacting on Europe today, which is why I want to talk about this topic. Some religions have a system of law which is integral to the faith. As I say, you don't just believe in the gods and the saints and the customs of that religion, you also accept that there's a law binding on you as a member of that religion. So the religious law applies to all who subscribe to the religion. But exactly what that means is often in dispute. You know, who does subscribe? Am I a Muslim because my parents were? Some say yes, some say no. Am I a Jew because my parents were? Very often the answer is yes. So there's a lot of disputes about exactly whom the religious law governs. Territory is easier to define, obviously. And territorial law applies to all who reside in the territory. But it also makes a distinction, as I said earlier, between those who belong there and those who don't. You know, if you're just passing through, you're just a tourist, temporarily resident, then you don't actually belong in the territory, but you still have to obey the law while you're here. But on the other hand, your rights and your duties are different from those of the citizen. The citizen has a complete set of civil rights and also a complete set of civil duties. He or she has to fight in a time of war, for instance, as the non-citizen does not. So we are now habituated to this territorial conception. I think everybody in this room, as an American, or maybe not everybody in this room is an American, but all Americans in this room are totally habituated to the territorial conception of jurisdiction. But the same is not true everywhere. And you can see this by the contrast between these two phrases, a Christian American. That seems absolutely natural. You know, if you want to say what kind of American you are, you might say, I'm a Christian American. As you might say that I'm an African American or whatever. It's the American bit that defines you, not all the qualifications of faith and race and attachment that you might add to that. But a Syrian Christian will define himself the other way around. First of all, a Christian, and a Syrian, of course, because that's the way that geography has imposed itself upon him. Likewise, a Syrian Muslim or a Syrian Alawite, and so on. Right. I want to say a few things about religious law before moving on to territorial law. We're all familiar with religious law because, after all, the Bible begins from the exposition of Jewish law, the commandments that are given in the Torah, in the first 4 books of the Hebrew Bible, and the various commentaries upon that. And Jews in particular have amplified those commentaries down the ages to create an incredibly complex, and some would say finicky system of legalese which governs every single aspect of the life of the Jewish community. But however, there is no clear territory, or has for many years not been any clear territory which this law governed. It was kept alive in exile from the time of the destruction of the temple right through into the restoration of the Jewish state in Israel. And even today, the state of Israel is not governed by the Jewish law as you in this room would know it from the Hebrew Bible. It's governed by the remnant of the British law that was imposed upon Palestine after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, with all sorts of qualifications along the way. It's essentially an offshoot of European judicial systems. Leaving that aside, the Jewish law, as religious people know it, was kept alive in exile and purged of its territorial character. And it never applied in the same way to Jews and to Gentiles. And St. Paul, in his letters, invokes a new kind of law. St. Paul was a Jew, but he was also a Roman citizen, versed in the Roman conception of law, which was not a religious law at all. The Roman law, the law of the Roman Empire, was designed to maintain order over the territories of the Roman Empire, regardless of the religion of the subject people. And St. Paul wanted something like that of his new law, a law that made no distinction between Jew and Gentile. And it was inspired in part by Roman territorial law. Okay, so over the years, the Jewish law has been adjusted and refined to apply to all the circumstances which the Jews have had to live under and suffer, and it's an amazing instance of the survival of religious jurisdiction in adverse circumstances. And it's there today, much as it was 2,000 years ago, or much as it was during the period of the Babylonian exile. But at a certain stage, in particular in the post-Reformation Europe, there was a big effort to reconcile the Jewish law with the public law of the state. After all, the Jews, for many centuries, had to live under jurisdictions which were not Jewish, as minorities conducting their own particular form of life, often in slightly hidden or even oppressed circumstances, and they had to reconcile their obedience to their own law, their own religious law, with the territorial law of the state, and adapt themselves to becoming, if possible, citizens of the state. And this is one of the great transformations of a community that we have witnessed. The Torah, which tells the Jew how to conduct his daily life, was to a certain measure privatized. It was said it was regarded as something which governs your life. It's a way of consecrating your life according to the rule of your ancestors. But it was not to take precedence over, or even, if possible, not to conflict with the surrounding public law of the state. If it did, then the result would be dangerous. So the Jewish community learned to adapt to a territorial system of law governing its dealings with the surrounding world, while privatizing the law that really mattered. And at a certain point, of course, with the birth of the Enlightenment, the question was raised as to whether the Jewish law itself was, in fact, in any kind of conflict with the surrounding law at all. Isn't it just our way, and this is what people thought, it's just our way of dealing with the natural condition of humanity, with life within the family, life within our personal obligations. That's our way of dealing with it. Other people might deal with it differently, but we Jews deal with it this way. This is our way of consecrating the life of love within the homestead. But it's not in conflict with the surrounding world, and perhaps can be integrated into the Enlightenment vision of a universal secular rule of law to which all communities adhere. And the person who was famous for expressing that view is Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn was a rabbi in the 18th century Germany who was became extremely friendly with the philosophers of the Enlightenment, in particular Lessing and Kant, and who greeted his view of the religious community with enthusiasm. Mendelssohn advocated freedom of conscience within a secular system of law, and also a criterion for accepting what religions were acceptable and what were not. Mendelssohn thought that a religion should be judged in accordance with whether it produced good people, and the good people were those who could live in peace with their neighbours regardless of differences of opinion about things like religion. So he made a big step towards saying that really a religious person has to accept a kind of secular government, accept the territorial jurisdiction in which he is situated, and privatize his religion. And this was a view which Kant endorsed enthusiastically and became, I suppose, the accepted view in Germany at the turn of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. You will know the name Mendelssohn because of his grandson, the great composer. And that is the situation, roughly speaking, today. But things have changed, of course, in Europe since then, in that there is another kind of religious law which has entered our thinking and in our experience, and is entering it in a rapid way, with unforeseen demands upon European systems of government through the mass migration of Muslims into European countries. And you won't be surprised if I tell you that this is causing a strain, because after all, even here in America, it has caused a certain strain, although Muslims have integrated into America in a way which they haven't universally in Europe. Right. Islam is a system of law. That's the first thing to understand about it. It's not just a matter of believing in God and his creative relation to the world. God laid down a law for all mankind. He issued a kind of manual for the use of life. And that manual is one that we should study and obey. Although, of course, things have changed over the years, still, always Muslims go back to the Quran as the primary source of Islamic law. There are other sources. There's the Sunnah, which means the traditions, which are derived from the exemplary life of the Prophet. What would he have done, or what did he do in response to this or that problem, and so on. Also consensus. If there's a sufficient consensus among pious and learned people, that too can be a source of law. And sometimes analogy, qiyas, is used to derive a law in unusual circumstances. But in the end, everything goes back to the Quran as the revealed word of God, and the Sunnah, and the traditions which are derived from the life and sayings of the Prophet. Now, that law, therefore, has been in existence for, well over a century and a half. It's something that has an extraordinary authority for Muslims. And the question is, what authority does it have for the rest of us? It's not a territorial law. It's addressed to those who believe. The Quran, the verses of the Quran always addressed explicitly, you who believe. And the question is, how strongly do we have to believe in order to be addressed by the Quran? And the answer is, it doesn't matter how strongly you believe, you're not actually addressed by anything else. This is the final authority in legal matters. So it's understood as the direct command of God, although it's amplified by example and analogy. and as such, it has to replace all competitors. You know, there's no way in which you can say, well, that's what the Quran says, but here is what I think. The competitors are overruled. And the great question then is, can it govern non-believers? And this was a problem, obviously, which arose at the beginning of Islam, because Islam established its authority by conquest of vast territories in which there were non-believers resident as existing communities, and of course it was not possible to murder them all, nor is it possible to force them to convert, because many of them wouldn't. The idea arose of a dhimma, which means a treaty. This is a kind of concession to the idea of territorial law. The dhimmi, the people who are allowed to exist as rival communities, are non-believers within Muslim territory, but they're protected by the treaty. So Christians and Jews were protected by the treaty as people of the book, people who had a sacred text of their own, and so should be allowed to get on with life according to their own principles. Although, from the point of view of the law, they had an inferior status. They didn't have the same rights under the law as Muslims had, and indeed, in many respects, were tyrannized. So that's the kind of legal system, at least, which grew up in the early days of Islam, and there's a question as to whether it is still operative, and if so, how can it be reconciled to the sort of legal order that we have inherited in Western states? And that is the big question, I think, that is being confronted by European states today. In particular, the great question is, can this law, this rigid set of precepts which derive from the Quran, can it adapt? Can it change in response to changing circumstances? Because we think that law should adapt, because after all, if it exists to govern a certain territory, as the people in that territory adopt new habits, new customs, new forms of production and so on, the law should surely adapt to accommodate them. And we after all, make the law ourselves. That is the American and also the European tradition. Law is made by the legislature or by the judges in the common law court. It's made in response to changes in social circumstances. But can the Islamic law change in that way, in response to changes in social circumstances? After all, God issued these laws, so it is believed. God knew what he was doing, and he seems to have laid it down for all time, because the Quran itself says that this is the final revelation. There will be no further prophecy, no further issue of instructions from on high. So why should the law adapt? And this has created a vast problem, I think, for Muslims in the modern world. As a majority in a Muslim state, it's perfectly easy for Muslims to say to themselves, well, I'm trying to live by the Sharia, by the law of, by the holy law which is commanded to me, and I will try and accommodate those minorities if I can, in the traditional way. But what if Muslims are a minority in a majority non-Muslim state? What do they do in response to the prevailing system of law, especially if it's a territorial law? You know, a law which, like ours, is secular, adaptable, made by human beings, and not dependent on divine revelation at all. Indeed, might marginalize divine revelation, as the American Constitution does in its First Amendment. You know, what does a Muslim do then? Now, at a certain stage in the development of Islamic jurisprudence, around the 10th century, it was declared by certain philosophers, the Ash'arite school, that, as the saying is, the gate of ijtihad is closed. Ijtihad is the efforts that people make to interpret things anew, to find an adaptation of the law so that it really does fit. and jurists worked on these things. But the Sunnis declared after that no, or many of them did, the gate of ijtihad is closed. Everything has been settled for all time. We just have to go back always to the Quran and the sources of Islamic law, and not try and change anything, which has led to, is one of the reasons why there's such a strain in many parts of the Muslim world today. Shiites differ over this. They allow ijtihad and have constantly been amending the law, and it's one cause of the deep conflict that we see in the Middle East today between the Sunni states and the Shiite states, the Shiite being essentially Iran, and Syria as a kind of ally. I won't go into that, that's too complicated. But either way, Muslims have been opposed to secularization. It's very difficult to accept that the law, the fundamental law that governs you, is secular. That means is the product of our existence in this world and our attempt to make a law for ourselves by purely human reasoning about purely human affairs. Secularization means rejecting the idea that law is founded in the will of God, and instead adopting the notion that law is founded in human decisions, the decisions of people who are coexisting in a certain territory. And that's really our situation, that we have a territorial law because we want our law to be the result of our own decisions and adapted to our own circumstances, and to acknowledge that our circumstances change. You know, we're not in the same position today as we were 2,000 years ago. And this is a legacy of the Roman law in many ways. The Roman Empire was based on a territorial system of law. Wherever the Roman emperor's authority was exerted, the Roman law was exerted with it, and it was exerted over everybody within the territory. But something similar also occurred in Anglo-Saxon countries in the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages. We developed our system of law, which became the English common law, which then eventually became the law of this country. And this law, like the Roman law, was territorial. It applied within the territory of the sovereign power. And both of these systems are secular. They're designed to govern people within a given territory according to decisions of their own, decisions of their monarch or of their parliament, whatever. You know, we have different ways of arriving at legislation, but it's nevertheless we who do it. So the great question is, what happens if they conflict with religious rulings, if our law conflicts with religious rulings? And this question is raised in the New Testament itself, in the parable of the tribute money, which Christians among you may know. The tribute money was the money paid as a tax to the Roman authorities by all people within the empire. And Christ was asked, you know, is it really within religious, is it permitted by religion to pay this tax, to pay a tribute to Caesar, especially at a time when Caesar had declared himself to be a god, you know, which Augustus and his son Tiberius had just done. And Christ's response was, you know, to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. In other words, in those matters where obedience to the state is in question, it's the state which has the right to demand your obedience. But in other matters where God alone has authority, then it's to God that you owe your obedience. And the assumption was that these matters are different. One is about the public sphere, and one is about the private sphere, the private devotions of the individual on which his salvation depends. And the thought is that they won't conflict, provided religion is given its proper place in the human heart, instead of being imposed as a uniform law on everybody, regardless of their belief. So this was, if you like, the first step towards that Enlightenment position that Moses Mendelssohn defends, you know, that the law the objective law is secular, but the private law is religious. So that's the proper place of religious law, governing the spiritual development of the individual and the obligations that the individual has in the sphere of morality and personal relations. Well, obviously, it isn't as simple as that. These two systems can conflict. People can easily think that they have a divine obligation to do this or that it's incumbent upon them for religious purposes to massacre a particular community, or at least to force them to obey the kind of principles which govern themselves. And as we know, in Britain, in the 17th century, there was a massive conflict in Parliament over the idea of godly rule. The Puritans wanted to impose upon the English people and on Scottish people what they called godly rule, a rule of law which was entirely derived from biblical precepts and which would force people to be obedient Christians in everything, and wouldn't give any credibility to secular law which allowed some kind of lenience. And the whole of Europe was torn by this at the time, and the 30 Years' War began, at least in Central Europe, with the conflict between Protestant and Catholic, between Lutheran and Calvinist, etc. And the whole of the continent threatened to be torn apart, and peace was only established at the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, in which people at last decided that this attempt to impose a religious law on your neighbours, regardless of what they thought, was inevitably going to lead to deadly conflicts. And one had to accept that the real principle governing legislation was the territorial one. It was expressed in this principle, cuius regio, eius religio. Whatever the rule is, that determines the religion. So it's for the secular power to decide what the religion is of the people within the territory. So the prince can say that I'm going to be governing a state of which the official religion is Calvinism or Lutheranism or Catholicism. Those are the three alternatives offered. But at the same time, the treaty said, even if there is an official religion, still the freedom to dissent from it has to be recognized. People have to be allowed in their private lives to worship in another way. So all this is relevant to our situation today, because we are heirs to that treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia, which created essentially the nation state. It said that the people of Europe are no longer going to be governed by the various religions that have been contending for ascendancy. They are going to accept that they're governed within certain boundaries, and in those boundaries it's the monarch or the parliament or whatever the sovereign entity is that determines the law. And that is really what the nation state is all about. Establishing boundaries, confining the territory, and establishing a rule of law which is secular, a secular rule of law over that territory. And the struggle to obtain the nation state has been really part of our history from very early on. If you look back over English history, always the English crown, right from the 13th century onwards, was struggling against the attempt by the papacy to impose a religious law on the people of England. Always the thought was, no, the crown takes precedence over the Pope. In other words, that secular law takes precedence over the ecclesiastical jurisdiction. And eventually, of course, by the time of the Renaissance and certainly the Reformation, that was pretty well established. There had been, however, even then, a division of labour between ecclesiastical and secular law. And this is something which we're now going through, especially here in America. And it's a very interesting offshoot of this process whereby the law was gradually secularized. What do we do about marriage? We in Britain and here in America inherited essentially a Christian idea of marriage, that it was really an ecclesiastical law that governed the bond between husband and wife, and that ecclesiastical law, that religious conception of marriage, had been transcribed into the secular law, so that, for instance, bigamy was, and still is, a crime. You can't have two wives. You can't have two husbands, whatever. And it was a very serious crime until very recently. And that's because of the religious tradition. Also, the marriage is not a contract. It's a special relation in secular law just as much as in religious law. It's a bond, an oath of allegiance between two people which cannot just be broken by decision. That's changing too. Of course, divorce is becoming easier and easier, but nevertheless, those religious ideas remained as part of the secular law of marriage right up till recently, because marriage was defined by the church as a sacrament, and the secular power took this over, because it recognized that it had to have a law of marriage. Even in the communist states, after a brief flirtation of Lenin's, marriage came back as a state-governed institution, but nevertheless one founded upon those inherited religious ideas. Okay, so and now, of course, we're really facing, for the first time, the idea that marriage is not a religious idea at all, that it's just the secular state that tells you what is or is not a marriage, and so why not, have marriage between people of the same sex, or between brother and sister, mother and son, whatever you want. It's up to us, since we make these laws, to make them according to the feelings of the people. And most people feel, gosh, no, you can't go that far. Let's stop short of incest, at least. But on the other hand, it's going that way. And that's an interesting example of the way in which gradually secular law drives religious law out of the arena altogether. So what emerged, anyway, as a result of this conflict was the idea of the nation and the idea of citizenship as the primary social bond. That it's not obedience to the priest or the acceptance of a religion which makes you a member of the community. It's your citizenship in the nation state, your obedience to the secular law within a certain territory, which is your country. So land becomes much more important than God. The earth becomes more important than the heavens in this form of legislation. And that is really where we've got to. A territorial jurisdiction requires national loyalty, and this loyalty is defined by borders. And those are the things we have to defend in any conflict. And here is where we enter the real problem that we're confronting in the modern world. And this is where I've just got a few more remarks to make so as to put this in context. Every community, political community, requires a first-person plural. We have to have a sense of who we are. We're not just a collection of individual I's, individual atoms. We are a we. And this we defines our responsibility to each other. What we have made, what we've inherited and what we share, and what demands our sacrifice. In America in particular, people salute the flag, and there are little rituals whereby they remind themselves that they are, if they're going to sacrifice themselves at all, it's for the flag, for the nation. And all Americans, regardless of their religion, have that inscribed in their hearts, or at least the hope is that they do. And religious law would be no use in this connection. Religious law doesn't demand that you define your loyalty in terms of territory, in terms of the inherited customs and of a secular community or a secular law. It demands that you define your allegiance in terms of your obedience to God. And this is the real deep reason why the Middle East today is in such a mess. That we tried at a certain stage to divide it all up into nation states. The Sykes-Picot Accords in 1917, prior to the end of the First World War, and the destruction of the Ottoman Empire left the place in total confusion, and the idea of the Western powers was, well, let's divide it into nation states and introduce secular law everywhere and forget about all those old communities. They'll have to get used to a new kind of law and govern themselves as we govern ourselves according to our allegiance to the place where we are. In other words, to define our primary loyalties in terms of neighborhood rather than belief. So if I happen to be a Muslim living next door to a Christian, he as my neighbor is important to me, not the fact that he differs from me in his belief. Now, this had never worked under the Ottoman Empire, which had tried all that and settled for what was called the millet system. A millet is Turkish for with Arabic millah, for a sect, a religious sect. And the Ottoman Empire had wisely said, of course we need an overarching system of law, but we also need separate systems for each religious community. The Orthodox Christians or the Malachite Christians will all have a different law for their own marriages, inheritance, domestic arrangements. It's only when it comes to the public administration of the whole system that we'll share the law, and that will be the law imposed from Constantinople, or Istanbul as it became. So we had parallel systems of law, an overarching law which was not entirely secular, it pretended to be derived from the Sharia, but also these little subsystems of law which governed the communities. But of course, once the whole empire had broken down, that couldn't possibly work. And this is why, and Ataturk saw this, and recreated Turkey as a nation state. He recognized that the national idea is what we need, an idea of loyalty and law defined over a given territory. Because under a national form of allegiance, we are all in the same position as our neighbors. It's neighborhood that matters, not faith. And of course, there's bound to be conflicts, and that's something which I'll pass over because the whole history of the Middle East since has been a history of conflict. But just some concluding remarks about what would bring peace to people, what does bring peace to people. I think this is where we should look back over the history of Europe and recognize that the kind of chaos that we see in the Middle East today, we went through too in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it was brought to the end, first of all, by a rule of law, and secondly, by insistence that the law was not a religious institution, but a territorial institution. And it applied to everybody within the jurisdiction and took precedence over their religious convictions. If their religious convictions conflict with the law, it's not the law that goes, it's the religious convictions. You've got to privatize them. Because only in that way can the law adapt to the continually changing problems of human communities. Human beings are difficult creatures who are constantly in conflict with each other. And always there'll be some new problem. If the law can't adapt, then it can't solve that problem. Things will fall apart. And we, in our jurisdictions, the Anglophone people, have enjoyed the great advantage of the common law, which gives to the judge a power to adapt law, to find new solutions to evolving problems, without having to go back to the sovereign and make everything again ab initio. And this has been very interesting for us throughout these difficult times that we've all lived through. Some examples, punishment, for instance. As people have found it more and more difficult to inflict severe punishments on each other, the law has adapted and produced new punishments. Prison, fine, community service, rather than decapitation, crucifixion or whatever. This has been a process that's, as it were, contained within the secular laws. It automatically adapts We haven't seen this in Islamic law. Ask someone, who pretends to be an authority in Islamic law, what the punishment for adultery is, really. Is it stoning to death or not? You won't get a clear answer. Certainly not from the people who are in the habit of speaking for Islamic law. Some will say yes, some will say no, because there's no way in which it has been able to adapt to the change in sexual mores and also the change in our conception of the severity of that particular offence. No, we all accept that I assume that it's not a good thing to do, but nevertheless, stoning to death seems going a bit over the top in response to it. Likewise with family law. Family law is constantly evolving under a secular jurisdiction. Through divorce laws, new kinds of arrangements are acknowledged and protected by the law. People are enabled to develop in new ways, not necessarily ways of which we approve morally, but nevertheless, order is maintained, and the potential conflicts, which are huge, because after all, it's sex and things which are involved, and they are the sources of all conflict. That these conflicts are avoided, and likewise with the protection of minors. They can be protected from their family now, and aren't simply dictated to by the family. And this is extremely relevant in Europe today, where girls in Muslim families can be forced into marriage against their will, or even killed for sexual relations outside the permitted category, and so on. Right, so the secular law, in particular common law jurisdictions, adapts immediately to these changes in social mores in ways which maintain peace, even if they also seem to condone behaviour which may very well be not of the best from the moral point of view. Whereas the Islamic communities find it extremely difficult to adapt to these great changes in our ways of life today. And this kind of solution is impossible without national loyalty, without the idea that we belong to a territory, a nation state, and a secular law which has the first claim on our allegiance. And in the Middle East, of course, that idea has still not got purchase. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt its great philosopher, Sayyid Qutb, actually argued in several of his books that the nation state is a kind of blasphemy, because it's an attempt to usurp God's privilege. It's an attempt to say that we, human beings, have the right to make law, and we have the right to make a law which overrides the law laid down for us by Allah. And surely that can't be true. Therefore, we must struggle against the nation state and work instead for a universal ummah of the Muslim people who govern themselves purely by the holy law, regardless of boundaries and so on. And of course, that's a recipe for instability in the modern world, and one reason why, whenever the Muslim Brotherhood get near to power in Egypt, the army takes over. So this is the real problem of the mass migration into Europe, and it's why many young Muslims in Europe cannot accept the prevailing law, or they regard it as a temporary compromise that shall one day be replaced by the true law of God. And many of them, as you know, have been going off to Syria in order to join ISIS, where they will, they think, enjoy this real form of law, the law which speaks to their heart, which is not a territorial law at all, but is a law governing all those who owe allegiance to God alone. So it's a great question of what should European states do? I'll end with this question, because I think seeing it this way makes it clear to you, I hope, that there really is a problem that Europe is confronting, especially with the mass immigration of Muslims from the Middle East. What can we do? Can we open again the gate of ijtihad? In which case, how wide can it go? How wide can we open it? Can we open it as wide as to persuade Muslims to accept our kind of family law, our kind of protection of minors, protection of girls, and so on? Consider, the cases of marriage, and bigamy, and so on. Are we going to allow Muslims to have 4 wives, even though women aren't allowed 4 husbands under their rule? Are we going to allow this massive inequality between men and women, which goes against all the founding principles of our jurisdictions? Well, you know, who is to compromise and how? This is the great question, and whether and can they? So I'll leave you with that. My hope was simply to make clear to you that it's not a trivial question that is confronting Europe today, and I don't know myself exactly how to answer it. Thank you. Now you're allowed to ask questions apparently on any of this or anything else. Yes, Helena.
Thank you. So your argument seems to be that secularism is antithetical to Islam. And how would you then explain sort of the variation we see within the Islamic world in Turkey? I mean, not these days, of course, but prior to the
Yeah. Turkey is an interesting case. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Ataturk, who was then essentially the general, the chief commander of the Turkish armed forces, declared Turkey to be a nation state. He said, we're not going to be the Ottoman Empire anymore. He subsequently he fought the Western powers in order to establish the boundaries of Turkey, and he was brilliant. He established those boundaries so that they were more or less coincided with the places where Turkish was spoken. It has to be said that there are great questions about what happened to the minorities within those territories, and of course the Armenians to this day accuse the Turks of genocide. But leaving that aside, he had in his mind that the whole idea of the Sharia was nonsense. He forbade the Muslim clerics who had previously been legislating from the mosques to have anything to do with the law. He said he adopted a system of law based on Belgian and French precedents, which was written law of essentially derived from the Napoleonic jurisdiction of the 1800s. And said, this is how we're going to make Turkey work. And then there will be monogamy. Nobody can have more than one wife or more than one husband, not that husbands had ever been a choice. And he also inscribed into the Turkish constitution this wonderful law on hats. The law on hats, which was not ever to be amended, meaning you can't wear the fez with a little tassel on it, and women can't wear the hijab, and you've got to expose your face and your head to the other, just as Western people do. And all these are very perceptive thoughts, and he made Turkey work as a secular nation state. It's breaking down today because, of course, Erdogan is not a secular person. He wants to re-Islamize Turkey, but it was an example, however, Turkey, of the way in which the Muslim community could privatize its religion and live by a secular law. And it would be the example to follow. And the Kurds, likewise, who inherited from Ataturk that secular rule of law, also have a very strong national identity, which they want to put in the place of the Sunni Muslim identity, even though they are Sunni Muslims. So there are hopes there. And the Iranians, likewise, have a national identity. They are Shia, of course. But so there are hopes. Yes, I've forgotten your name. Hannah, that's right.
in a world that is like social media and information available to everyone on anything by anyone, do you think this will accelerate the spread of fundamental religious law or hinder it, especially for young people?
It's a very interesting question. And which way? It seems to go both ways. The whole Islamic State has depended on social media to recruit people and to create its new identity as something which is both a part of the modern world and yet totally traditional in its beliefs. On the other hand, what I'm saying today could also be broadcast by social media, although it's slightly not at the intellectual level perhaps that the social media are adapted to. But I think the more people, whether young people could ever gather themselves behind the cause of secular government is a big question. It's much easier to unite behind the cause of God than behind the cause of secular government. It's such an abstract idea, But I don't know. I think it's really interesting to know exactly what effect social media have on these kind of conflicts. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the banning of headdresses and furniture. Do you think that approach, like it's been attempted in France, do you think that approach in Western countries like the UK or the US, do you think that would do more harm than good? Or do you think maybe in the long run it would have a beneficial effect by integrating?
Well, this again is a very interesting point. I think there are two different ways in which Islamic dress in women in particular can go. One is the hijab, where you just wear a scarf around your head without in any way covering your face or removing yourself from public view. The other, of course, is the burqa and the and niqab and so on, which just cover your whole face, just leave the eyes or whatever. I take the view that the French are right to ban that full facial covering, because we are a face-to-face society. That's how we understand each other. We immediately relate to each other by looking each other in the eyes, addressing each other as equals. Men address women as equals. This is so fundamental to our sense of who we are that actually to cover your face in this way is a kind of offence. And I think you can easily say to someone, we find this offensive, but we're not forbidding you from going somewhere where people don't. And we don't seem to have the courage to do that. The French do have the courage to do that, and I think they're right. Anna again, yes.
Do you think there is things such as cultural law that might fit in between territorial and religion? So, for example, in Ukraine and the Russian, they're not bound by territory, and if they don't have the threat of destiny that the religious law would, but is there such a thing as a cultural law that is in between these two things, and where does that?
Yes, that's a very interesting suggestion. There is, most legal systems have at some stage made a distinction between the law of the state and customary law. In Denmark, I think this is a very important distinction. They should tend to be local jurisdictions, and in a way, that's what America is like. You have the law of the states and the federal law, which takes precedence whenever there's a conflict. But I think that rather than call this what you're referring to law, I would just say it's customs. That people do live by customs, and those have to be respected. But to transcribe them into law is probably going a bit far. There's a gentleman up there, I think, wanted to.
Yeah, question. Do you see any difference here between this fundamentalist Islamic kind of approach and fundamentalist Christian approach, ultra-Orthodox Jewish approach, or a Hindu fundamentalist kind of approach, that are very much present in our countries, in our territories,
Yes.
and that challenge in the same way the possibility of having a secular territorial kind of law. Here in the United States, we have Christian reconstructionists that believe that this is a Christian nation. In Israel, they have the Jewish nationalists that believe that only Jews are able to be citizens, or Hindus in India that go around doing things in
Yeah.
migration that normally when migrants come tend to integrate themselves and throughout time they become more secularized, no? As has been the case in the past.
Well, that's obviously you're making an important point about the fact that all religions, if they are founded on a system of law, can be in conflict with the secular law. That's entirely true. And I did give the example of Britain in the 17th century, where, of course, the Puritans did turn everything upside down, as we know, in their insistence that the secular law was ungodly, in defiance, in other words, of the principles laid down in the religion. But against what you were implying at the end, I would say we have adapted. It's not as though we do need, in Britain at least, we don't need to turn on our Christian population and say, you've got to adapt to the secular law. They did in 1688 already, and there hasn't been a real conflict between of that kind in Britain. Indeed, the Anglican Church was made into the official religion, the state religion of England, incorporated into the whole political process and neutralized. The sign of which is that there hasn't been an Archbishop of Canterbury who believes in God for the recorded memory. It's all completely adapted to what we are. And I think the great question is whether Islam could do this. My own personal view is that, and this is purely me, is that during the great period of the Islamic philosophers, the classical philosophers, Avicenna and Ibn Rushd and so on, and Al-Ghazali, that Islam was in the process of adapting to the then modern world, 11th and 12th century Europe, through its contact with Europe and so on. And it all stopped. There was a kind of complete loss of the Islamic civilization at a certain stage. And it's the sign of this is that if you travel around the Middle East, not that you can easily now, but if you do, you don't see anybody reading those people or studying all that stuff, all that discussion that Islam once provoked about how far the law can be adapted and what we are really and how we relate to other people. That seems to have disappeared. Maybe it's going to come back in Iran. I don't know, but even there, the 1001 Nights only exists in an expurgated edition, and Hafiz is only published by half. There's a kind of rejection of the Islamic culture by the Muslims themselves. So they're going through a period of rejection of of these sort of compromises. But maybe they can move back in the way that the Turks have done. But I wouldn't say, there's an instinctive reaction when you're attacked to join the enemy. We're attacked by the Muslims, so say, we're to blame. Americans are very good at saying we're to blame. So let's look for the Christian fundamentalists among ourselves and persecute them. But actually what is needed is standing up for something positive instead. That's what I would say. Yeah, of course.
The context that will surround you will be a context of intolerance, persecution, lack of equality, but it really will not make any difference with this fundamentalist kind of Islamic approach.
No. Of course, it's necessary to stand up for what you believe in all contexts, if you can. So, yeah. Well, I think that you're right that there's a distinction between saying that what we need is a purely secular system of law and saying what we need is religious toleration. You know, religious toleration accepts the importance of religion in people's lives, but also qualifies it by saying that it must be compatible with the choice among religions, or there being, no one religion being imposed, as the First Amendment says, not making an establishment of religion. Locke's essay on toleration is extremely interesting in this regard, because although he did advocate toleration of all the various sects, he refused to extend it to Catholics, Roman Catholics, on the grounds that they had an allegiance to something outside the kingdom, which is a very good sign that what he really meant was that they had an allegiance to something other than the nation state. So that he is really saying it's that your allegiance to the nation, to the secular law, the law as it made by us, that is the precondition of your being a member of the community at all. Once that condition is satisfied, then we can allow you to get on with your own faith in your private life as you wish. But if you have a faith which commits you to allegiance to some other form of authority in potential conflict with the crown, then we can't tolerate it. And that is very relevant to the Muslim case today, because that's what the Sharia says, that your allegiance is not to the secular power. What Sayyid Qutb says about the nation state, that your real allegiance is to Allah, and anything that conflicts with that is blasphemy.
Of religious followers, perhaps being a little bit more globalized, westernized, and having less adherence to tradition, I guess?
There is a very important generational difference. And what we have seen in Europe is something like this. That, we're now in the third generation of Muslim immigrants. So the ones who came after the war from the British Empire came, on the whole, with tremendous sense of hope. They're going to take part in a modern community. They're going to own a house and a car, and they're going to do a job and so on. And their children likewise are brought up in that hope, but nevertheless also brought up in the religion. But gradually the religion took over. And as the second generation found themselves without jobs, with difficulties of employment, and also without any real integration into the surrounding community for various reasons, which are very complex. The third generation then found themselves essentially brought up as aliens in the nation that surrounded them, but without any real sense of what they were. They knew what they weren't, but not what they were. They'd lost the ability to read Urdu, or to speak Urdu, and most of them only knew the Arabic from the Quran and scattered knowledge of it. So they hadn't really got anything to identify an alternative culture, but they did have the Quran. That was the one thing they had. And it was that third generation who sort of declared themselves at war with the secular culture. Those are the people who committed those terrible crimes in London and Madrid, blowing up people on the underground and so on. And they are the people who flee to Syria to join ISIS. That's the thing that's going to give them the identity of which they feel they've been deprived. And it's a very complex thing. I'm not an expert on it, but I can see exactly how it can arise. Gosh, we've got so many questions. Okay, two more? Yeah. I think I'm going to count you out, Hannah, because you've had two already. There's one here.
Following up with that, that's what's interesting, because one adds the economic dimension, and indeed the alienation. And even in one's own country, one leaves one's own country often for migration, because there are no opportunities economically. And
Yes, of course. This touches on a deep problem. When people immigrated to America originally, and they had to stay in wherever it was, and the island offshore, and what's it? East. Sorry. Ellis Island. That's right. They would come, whole families. They'd dress in their Sunday best in order to be inspected, and they went out into America when they were permitted, and they were going to make it. They were going to do their best. No, they weren't going to depend on anyone else. They would hope to find their community, like their community of little Czech community that is described by Willa Cather in My Antonia. You know, they would help each other become what they could be. That's a very, and of course their children very quickly became Americans. But when people immigrate into Europe now, vast numbers of them come because there's the welfare services on which they can depend. They're not going to make it for themselves. They've heard that you don't have to. You go and you get social housing, and you get a unemployment benefit, and you know, there's a whole level of society which is like that, which is not, it hasn't come with the intention of belonging, but with the intention of taking. And you can't discuss this in public, because even what I've just said sounds deeply politically incorrect, but it's true, you know, unfortunately. One last question. Yeah, you're allowed a question.
So you began, you mentioned the U.S. Constitution as an example of territorial law, like territorial law in Europe. I wonder whether you think that the U.S. Constitution, U.S. law could be described as sort of territorial law plus, the plus being that we hold on to this, at least a significant number of Americans, a surprising number of Americans, hold on to this view that this territorial law is grounded on or originates in something like natural law. So that it's the particular grounded in the universal. And my question, I suppose, is that an advantage in the American case?
Yeah.
Or is it a disadvantage?
I would say it's an advantage if you're a professor of political science teaching in a Catholic college. But it's a gloss on the American Constitution that the ordinary American doesn't really know anything about. I think, of course, it's true that the American Constitution emerged out of philosophical reflections, which in many cases reflected the natural law, but not all of them were believers in the natural law. You know, someone like Hamilton was more of a common law type, but it's a remarkable document because it concentrates into itself all that the 17th and 18th century had delivered by way of knowledge of what a political community can be. So it was an attempt to summarize the experience of history, really. And the idea of a fundamental right, which comes to the Declaration of Independence, all those have deep philosophical roots, I agree. But you also have to remember that it was designed to perpetuate the legal order that the colonists had inherited from the mother country. You know, they wanted the English law to carry on in its wisdom, solving their problems. And the creative aspect of the common law is that everything is reinterpreted all the time. The American Constitution is a beautiful short document, but there are also 400 cases of case law which are not beautiful at all. And if you don't know those, you don't really know what the document now means. Right.
There's a perception in